And of course, one of my favorite people in the whole world, a very, very talented Wida Books poet. Please, a resounding round of applause for Dr. Dami Ajayi.
Hello.
Good morning, Kaduna. Good morning. It's really good to be back here. So let's just jump into it and start with similarities. Oh, no, let's jump into it. Okay. So I'm going to introduce both books because the authors have been introduced already. And I'll start with House of Stone by Novuyo Tshuma. It's a first novel, but a second book. This book is about, or the premise of this book is a 17-year-old boy called Bukowski who is missing, possibly murdered by government-sponsored thugs. His friend Zamani, who also happens to be a lodger in Bukowski's parents' family house, knows more than is willing to tell the dismayed parents. Zamani coerces his friend's parents to tell their history, which he hopes to appropriate with his ploy of surrogacy. Ellen Abila says of this book that she has managed to not only sum up Zimbabwe's history, but also brings to life an African neighborhood and one remarkable house seen through the eyes of a young member of the household. The house is in a town that is seemingly lost in time, full of colorful, larger-than-life characters, and at the narrative heart is Grandpa, who is the family patriarch, whose occasional cruelty is balanced by his willingness to open his doors to those in need. A reviewer says that the novel is told in sparse prose that leans towards the clinical. Please give him a round of applause. Yeah, so let's jump in now. Yeah. And I'll start with similarities. You're both African writers living in Trumpland house in your books. Yeah. So the question I have to ask is, I know EC, you're a professor of creative writing, and you're doing your PhD in creative writing. And MFA programs are the stuff of what everybody's thinking about. I'm also thinking about doing one. And the whole idea is that there's been a critique of MFA programs and that it produces a certain type of writers and all that. I'd like to hear your experiences, both as people who've participated in it and someone who's actively working and drawing a living from it.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll start.
Yes.
Oh, great. I think that the idea of going to school to learn how to write is not such a bad thing. But I also think that one of the interesting canards, something that people believe, but it's not factual. That notion, people kind of think that writing is not something that can be taught. That's an opinion. People think so. I would speak from my own experience. I think that the MFA programs, especially because it's a very North American thing initially, even though it's spreading all over the world now, I think that one of the things that happened in the earliest programs was that they were not diverse at all. And so you had writers from the Midwest, or you had writers from New York who came to Iowa to do an MFA, and they basically had the same sensibility in terms of cultural sensibility. And as a result of that, you find that their aesthetics tend to be the same. Yeah. One of the things that I find very interesting with life in America, for instance, is how identical the lives of individuals can be. And so you have a kid who grew up in his hometown, and then he goes to elementary school with the same cohort of kids, and then middle school, and then high school. So he's known the same cohort all his life. That's all he's known. And so the experience is not going to be very different. You know, maybe he goes to college, but he could still go to college within that same area.
Space.
Yeah. So I think that there are two things with the MFA program. One is that one of the things that it did for me when I did it 500 years ago, it's very different now. But one of the things that it did for me was that it kind of introduced me to writers I wouldn't have read or known about. So my reading just went boom. I started reading. I mean, one of the guys I really love is a writer called Dennis Johnson. I wouldn't have read Dennis Johnson, you know, Jesus' son, if I hadn't gone to the MFA program. Kind of introduced me to those kind of writers. So my reading actually did expand. I read a lot of poetry because the poets were also cool. Now, that's one. Two is that I think also that there is a business aspect of writing. There is the business side of it. And so, for instance, while I was in Nigeria, I think one of the things I did was that I mailed a story to a literary journal from here. Back then, you used like snail mail. So I mailed it to them. And I used my friend's address, Mike Wosu. So I said, well, they should respond to that address. So I put, Mike put his self-addressed stamped envelope in it. And then, but here's the funny thing. They sent it back. They didn't even read the story because I submitted the story in the summertime. And journals don't generally, if they're campus-based, they don't read in the summer. So they sent it back. Okay, so that was how much I knew about the submission process. Now, it's a very different thing if you are in an MFA program. You kind of become savvy. You kind of know that you don't send this kind of story to the New Yorker, but that you could send it to Kalalu. You kind of know that these people called this kind of journal publishes very experimental stuff. Okay, so that thing is something that you're taught as well. The MFA program kind of helps you to do that. But in terms of, you know, the accusation is the cookie cutter kind of fiction. That's the American phrase, cookie cutter. It all comes out the same. I think that is changing. I mean, she's here. She's in an MFA. She did an MFA.
It's a different kind of
novel.
novel.
I did. You know, so they are going out of their way now to recruit diverse voices. To bring a different sensibility. And you can see what that has done. Jumpa Lahiri, she did an MFA program back when BU had an MA in creative writing. You can't tell me that her voice is the same thing as Jonathan Franzen, who didn't even go to an MFA at all. I think it's changing. And you know, I look at, sometimes I see stuff in a magazine and then I look at it and they say, oh, the name is African. So it jumps out at me right quick. I'll read it. And then they will say, oh, this person is completing an MFA. So I said, you know, there's a guy who's my friend who teaches in Syracuse. So what he told me, he said, you guys, you've brought your Nigerian hustle to the MFA. I said, what do you mean? He said, every year now we have tons of applications from Nigerians. We're overwhelmed, you know? And so that's it. I think the African hustle has come into the MFA program, and it's very different, yeah.
Novuyo, is it similar in Zimbabwe?
Well,
I mean, are you guys hustling them too?
I mean, picking up from what EC said, about the MFA program. So I don't think all MFA programs are actually. So speaking about Iowa and the diversity that EC is speaking about. So I went to Iowa in 2013, and this is where I actually got the opportunity to write House of Stone, right? So that work came out of that. It's not it doesn't fit the so-called category of an MFA book, right? But I was there with, in my year, there was a writer from India, from Jamaica, from Malaysia. There was a Jamaican-American, Iranian-American, these various sort of identities, right? So within that, you find there's this, my experience really of the Iowa MFA was diversity. And more importantly, I think the most important thing that an MFA affords you, which is not easy to get anywhere else, is time and money to write, right? So you're there, you're the writer, you're responsible ultimately for your work, you're responsible for what you take and for what you ignore. So I don't believe writers are these victims who go there and they're pressured into writing certain things. I feel like if maybe harsh, if you're that sort of person, maybe you shouldn't be writing, right? Because writing is an act of pushing against the world. So I feel like you go there, you know what you want to do, you take what's useful. Not everything will be useful in an MFA program, not everyone's feedback is useful. You take what's useful, you leave what's not useful, right? And you use the advantage, like seriously, use the advantage of space that's giving you money and time to write, right? And of course, knowing where you're coming from. If you're coming from Nigeria or Zimbabwe, they might not get everything that you're doing and your traditions. Yeah. And that becomes your sort of responsibility to figure out what's useful and what's not. Yeah. But I had a very positive experience at Iowa. That's why I'm speaking to that particular program. I think it was singular in the way in which it's able to give different writers space, right? And the way it's actually, as EC has said, actually diversified. A conscious effort to actually diversify and bring different voices.
Wow. There's a tweetable quote there. Writing is an act of pushing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to see a tweet like that. Let's go into the books now. Novuyo.
No, you've put pressure on me to say something quotable.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's
sorry.
I don't like that. Okay.
Sorry, just hit us with one.
Okay.
Okay, we'll take it maybe when you're ready. Maybe the next question, you hit us with a quote.
Okay.
So let's jump into the books. Novuyo, can you set it up for us and just read?
Okay, yeah. I'm just going to read for like 5 minutes. So Zaman, I'm reading from the beginning, so there's no need for context. Now, I'm a female, but this is a male protagonist. The narrator's male, so just pretend I have a deep voice, okay? So these intimacies that my surrogate father has begun sharing with me are what Bukosi always wanted from him. The boy badgered our father about the family history. Baba, he would ask, at first timidly, for he anticipated the rage such questions caused Abednego, who was never stingy with the belt. Baba, although not even the prospect of the belt deterred him. I want to know, Baba. So strong was this desire, so brilliantly did it flicker in his emerald eyes. How did you grow up? Shimmering like a thing hungry and searing and lost. Where were you during what was growing ever more defiant after I introduced him to Dumo, who took him under his wing, like he had tried to do for me, feeding the boy's hunger to know the past. I need to know. You have to tell me. His 17-year-old voice booming with a dangerous bass, suddenly mature in its insolence, different from his usual bratishness. I demand to know what happened during Kukuraundi. I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I'll read from a chapter called Uncle Aya, and basically the way this book works, euphemistically as the family house. And so the book actually just contains the stories of all the characters who lived in the house. So the house becomes some kind of organizing principle that holds it together. So I'll just read real quick. They came from every part of the city. Some came all the way from the surrounding villages and towns. Others had walked long distances, and their sweaty feet had accumulated a fine coating of dust. A few had brought cooking utensils and some foodstuff along with kerosene stoves. The poorer ones had brought along firewood and sawdust to light a fire and cook with. Grandfather always said that in a great man's house, you'll find at least one mad person. This was his usual response to the antics of Uncle Aya. Grandpa was of the view that each great household had both good and bad people. You will find wise men, lawyers, doctors, and the occasional mad fellow or eccentric. He said Uncle Aya was the eccentric in our great family, in our great household, and urged members of the household to at least accommodate his eccentricities. A few years back, Uncle Aya had started corresponding with a certain Pastor Jonah from the West Indies, who was also founder of End of the World Ministries. Uncle Aya would sometimes enlist us to help distribute their badly printed tracts, the black ink spilling from the words and the words aslant. Some of the printed words merged beyond recognition, inviting, it was where they showed a movie called The Photo Drama of the Creation of the First Day. Not really a movie as such, but moving photo slides. It showed how the earth was created from darkness. I recall some of the conversation around us as the images flashed. So someone was there with a film camera filming God as he made the earth? Wonders will never end.
Well, so your novels both feature a lot of storytelling and myth-making, which are all within the context of oral African traditions. My question really is was it a deliberate attempt to do that, and what were your reasons?
Later. you kind of...
Quote.
Yeah, oh, good. Okay, so yeah. The way fiction works is that you theorize later. You kind of... Yes, great. So I got that done. So that's out of the way. That comes first. And then when you're done, the reader says, wow, that character is named Caesar because he's so stubborn and political. And I say, yeah, oh, his name's Caesar, that's why. But I never thought of that. So I think that the story comes first. All I wanted to do was that I grew up in a house that was close to this family house. And I knew that there were individuals who came and who left. And I just felt like two things happened very quickly. When I went back to Lagos after a while, I discovered that, one, some of the houses that were major that stood on that part of the street had been demolished because they said they were on the path of a drain. So that kind of shocked me. And then also, there was a room in the house, for instance, in the house where I grew up, and that room was where my grandmother lived. And so I went to look at that room. You know, she didn't get along too well with my mom, but two of them were, you know, very political. So they, you know, oh, very nice, but they were not like real friends. So I went to take a look at that room, and then I realized that it's not actually a room, it's a pantry. Very small, it looked like a matchbox. Wow. You know, and so over time, I began to think some of the things that you thought were this way were not this way. And suppose I had come back to Lagos and this house had been demolished, what am I going to do? These stories need to be told. And I think that, you know, the house kind of gives me a basic architectural framework, as it were, with which all these characters can be realized. Yeah, so I didn't go out with some grand universal theory of how, you know, but I just wanted to tell those stories. I thought those stories were what
very important.
You know,
Thank you. Novuyo?
Well, I mean, so the way House of Stone is structured, you have Zamani, who's being told stories from his surrogate parents, right? The family he's lodging with. So you have the father who's telling him his stories. You have the mother who's telling him stories. And as the father, Abednego's telling him stories, he's also telling him his stories about people that he used to know, like a young woman called Tandi, who's in turn telling Abednego stories about her grandfather, who fought in the, like King Bengula when the colonialists came, the settlers, right? So you have this chain of oral, of storytelling being told. I mean, I think it's the most immediate way in the story to get information, but also my grandfather on my mother's side was an education administrator, so he was educated, but my grandmother on my mother's side was not, and my grandparents on my father's side were not, right? So they didn't know how to read, they didn't know how to write. That's how we got stories, right? They tell you stories, right? And even when I was talking to my family about the past, right? You talk to them. That's how I feel like we get our stories about the past, right? And about what happened, or who was where when, and what do our parents remember. So I think it's just, again, it's just a natural way of doing it, more than theorizing, right?
Okay, yeah, that's really nice. When I read your book, I thought very deeply about a Fela song called Teacher Don't Teach Me Nonsense. And really, Teacher Don't Teach Me Nonsense, apart from being one of the most difficult Fela songs to perform, I've seen the band refusing to perform it once. It also is a song about the problems of the colonial legacy. Following independence, a lot of early African independent states failed. And a lot of what your book is based on, or the fulcrum on which it sits, is the Gukurahundi massacre. So I'd like you to speak to that. Could you?
Oh, yeah. So the Gukurahundi massacre, or genocide, happened. So Zimbabwe, we gained our independence in 1980. So between 1982 to 1986, there was a massacre, genocide, by this special... It's a confusing genocide because it wasn't ethnic in the sense that one ethnicity didn't go to another region and massacre. But the specially trained soldiers, right? They were trained for President Mugabe by North Korea.
The 5th Brigade? The
5th Brigade. They were Shona speaking, and they went to Matebele land, and they committed atrocities. And so there was now that sort of cultural, ethnic element going on that way. But now, when history is told, and I think it happens with many African countries, post-independence, and this happens a lot in the West, there's this sort of convenient forgetting about colonialism, and it becomes a very singular story that's floating, senseless wars, senseless genocide, and it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy of Africa, right, as the senseless place. Only now it's changed with the politics to patronizing pity, right? So when I was just when I was reading up about history, so you do realize that people like Mugabe were a product of the colonial, right, system. And you actually realize the mechanisms that Mugabe used. Some of the CIO agents, right, Central Intelligence Operations officers, were actually inherited from Rhodesia. Some of the laws that were used, states of emergency in Matabeleland, were directly inherited from the structure of the country of Rhodesia, right? So you do have that structural, right, colonial legacy that's now being implemented. You also have, of course, the psychological, right? It's like the sort of same philosophy, but the actors have changed. It's now African on African versus white British on African, right? So that's what I really was interested in. That's why the novel actually starts at the center is the genocide, because it's actually close to Zamani, but it starts from when we were still Rhodesia, and it goes back to when 1890s when Cecil John Rhodes came. Because when I was reading the history, it was interesting. You just start connecting the dots. You start going back. You're like, so the premise for my novel was, how did we come to be where we are in Zimbabwe? This was 2009, inflation, we were the battle, we were the joke of Africa. We used to laugh at Malawi's potholes, and now we had inherited bigger potholes than they had. So I just kept going back in history, like, how did this start? And you just can keep going back, actually, and you find a pattern, like things that keep happening, cause and effect. So that's what actually informed why the novel is structured that way. Like, it tries to capture that colonial and post-colonial to link them and have that understanding of how that was working. At least that's what Zamani is trying to figure out.
Also, Zamani has this thing, there's a deconstruction of the word history itself, which is really I story, right? I story. History, or I story, we could also call it that. And for me, it's also important because at the core of the novel is an exploration of the plurality of history. And what is most important to me about this history is that there are no heroes. And that's unusual, because the stories we are told, they are heroes. So how did you come to this realization in writing your novel?
I respect our heroes in Zimbabwe, Liberation War heroes. They fought in the Liberation War. I was just fed up of that story. It's the single story in Zimbabwe, to quote Chimamanda. So it's the single heroes and villains. And anyone who's not considered a hero is always made to feel less than. So it wasn't something I did consciously, actually. I think it's when the novel was done, and I've been told this repeatedly, there are no heroes. I'm like, oh. But I think it was sort of deconstructing that idea, which can be a very oppressive idea, that you're either a hero or you're either just a nobody, right? And you find Abednego, right, the surrogate father, in the novel, not to give away a lot, he claims the status of hero in post-independence Zimbabwe. He fought in the war, he's getting a pension, but when you learn his history, he did not actually fight in the war. But it's that all-consuming status. So when I was reading up about our history in Zimbabwe and learning about these stories, you find stories that are not actually in the main narrative. People who are not heroes, but who actually had these fascinating lives. So I was really fascinated by that, these different stories that are not in the main narrative. So it's, of course, important to say, I respect our heroes, but we're just fed up of that single story. It becomes oppressive, right? It's been used to oppress us. If you're not a hero, keep quiet. You have no right to the country. That's actually what's been happening, right? You're nobody, just keep quiet, take the crumbs, stop complaining.
That's another quote. Hope you're not under any pressure. This house is not for sale, beware of 419.
Or beware of my son Kamoru.
Oh. Yeah, but in interacting with you, you told me that is not really what it is.
Yeah, it's part of it, but that's not all. Yeah, there is also a song by Bryan Adams, which talks about which is called "This House Is Not for Sale." A lot of people have done the covers, but each time when people see this in the U.S., they assume that it's the Bryan Adams song, which is very funny. But I now went back, and began to kind of unpack the song. And, the song is talking about this young couple who got a place And now I think maybe they are being forced to move out. And, he's trying to recall all the things that he did in that house. Okay, and so I think that was partly where this came from. But more importantly, also, there was, back in the day, like when I lived in Lagos, I always say 500 years ago, because such a long time.
Long time.
Yes, but when I lived in Lagos now, it's different now. But then, if you were driving, we used to go to the island for meetings. Lola and I hustle. So we'll go to the island for meetings. And on the right, just before you get on top of the bridge, there was this isolated house. It's a story building, but it's abandoned. And so you'll see it there, it's right next to the ocean, but nobody lived there. It had been there like forever. And I always wondered, who built this house? Who was this person who wanted an ocean front view, but eventually didn't live there, and then the house is abandoned, and houses mean a lot in Lagos, and his children didn't take over the house. When I came back to Nigeria 3 years ago, so I went looking for that house. I couldn't even recognize that place anymore because, it's become a concrete jungle. Every part of that place is built up. So that house doesn't stand. It's right bunch of houses and then the ocean.
It's interesting because that house also haunted me. I hear that TK Tunde Kelani shot some part of Tioluwanile, which is one of his early films, in that same house. The ghost scene especially, and it was really very haunting.
That's interesting,
It's really very interesting. But now, Lagos has changed a lot over the years. And I guess you've already mentioned this, but I'd still like you to dilate a bit more. Was your novel also an attempt to reconstruct the Lagos of your nostalgia, given that gentrification and change has happened?
Nostalgia it's a very interesting word for me. For some reasons, people talk about nostalgia, thinking of, of the past, right? But there's also nostalgia for the present. Which is which is interesting, yes. And then there is nostalgia of the future. It's very interesting. You think that one of the things about nostalgia, if you look at African literature from independence, from the 60s, the negritude poets, Things Fall Apart, Wole Soyinka, and a whole bunch of them, Kamerlai, it's nostalgic literature if you really want to theorize it. It's really this idea of the African past being beautiful and capturing it in literature. So it's really played a huge role in African literature, literary aesthetics. If you talk of nostalgia, again, you talked about Trump land. Actually, Trump's campaign is built on this nostalgia for something that never existed.
Make America great
again. Make America great again. Okay, so that's it. So that means that there was a time America was great, and then now you have to bring it back. Okay, so that's nostalgia again. So it could be a dangerous thing. It could be. But the thing with nostalgia, again, is that we tend to kind of see the past with rose-tinted glasses. We think the past is always better. It's a human thing. We think the past is always better, and that might not necessarily be true. And so one of the things that there's a bit of nostalgia. I remember that I had fond memories of the house. I had fond memories of my grandfather's house. I had fond memories of people I grew up with, uncles and people who just stroll into the house and then they don't never leave. I thought that's a very interesting thing, that these days, you tell someone that, oh, I'm going to visit, and he says, okay, how long will you stay? And now, in my culture, you could never say that, but now, I almost feel like putting up a sign in my house. It's a quote from, who's that? Some Russian writer. He said that visitors and fish begin to smell after 3 days. So you want to come, spend 3 days and go.
Quotes.
Otherwise, it's no longer fun. So, but I also knew that there was some of the stories were not really savory. They were not like this rose-tinted thing. And I wanted to capture all of that.
All of that,
yes.
Coming to you, nostalgia. You wrote most of your novel in America about Zimbabwe. So was there a role? Did nostalgia play a role in it?
No. I mean, I just arrived in America, so I hadn't been there long enough to feel nostalgic in that sense. But it's interesting what EC said about nostalgia being also a yearning for the future. Because so this thing, so I'm sure I don't know if I'm sure that maybe they do this here too in Nigeria. Zimbabweans, black Zimbabweans. In the past 10 years, you hear people saying, and it used to be an offensive comment until you really think about it, like, oh, we were better under colonization. Things were better, and it's that idea, rose-tinted glasses, right? And then until you realize that that sort of statement is actually not a yearning to go back to colonialism, right? Because things were horrible then, right? You had privileges that you couldn't have. But it's actually a yearning, right? Either for the more recent past, post-independence, or a future that hasn't been realized, right? It's that idea that when we gained independence, we thought we thought the future was bright. But from where we are standing, we're disappointed. So it's that sort of idea of yearning. It's not a direct yearning to go back to colonialism, but it's a yearning for a future that has not been realized, right? That has been failed. So I loved that idea of thinking of nostalgia. But no, House of Stone, I don't think, it doesn't sound nostalgic, is it? If anything, I think it's very visceral, very polemic, critical of Zimbabwe as a space. Criticism.
Hands, please.
You wanted to talk about superstition.
Oh, yes. I mean, I was still 20 minutes.
Oh, good.
So we'll come back to your questions. I'd like you to talk about superstitions.
A lot of them. 13th floor, baby boy in blue, girl in pink, bless you when you sneeze because they thought you were going to die. There's a lot of that. But over the years, it seemed like in the way of a good story. There's this
quote.
Yeah. So there is this physicist named Niels Bohr. Does anyone know him? Niels Bohr, B-O-H-R? Great. So Niels Bohr, he won the Nobel Prize for physics. So he's a man of science.
Yes.
So a journalist went to visit Niels Bohr, and he saw a horseshoe by the door. Now, in Europe, a horseshoe is something that's supposed to bring you good luck. So it's some kind of talisman. People hang it by their door. But this is something done by illiterate farmers, not Niels Bohr. No. So the guy saw it on Niels Bohr's door and said, certainly, Dr. Bohr, you don't tell me that you believe in this nonsense. He said, I'm a man of science. I'm a scientist. Of course, I don't believe in it. So the guy said, but why do you have it on your door? He said, I hear that even if you don't believe in it, it still works. So that, for me, is what superstition is about. Yes, that's it. Even if you don't believe in it, it still works. Yeah, so why shouldn't I work with that? Why wouldn't I use that in my... So that's really my approach to it.
Really great. Yeah. So can we have our questions? Starting with the lady in brown.
Hi, Novuyo, I have a question for you. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more about the things that you personally took from Iowa and the things that you chose to leave.
So, for instance, in a workshop, you have about 12 people, and one thing, once you leave after your 2 years, you probably have, from those 12 people for a workshop, so maybe you're with about 40 different people. You'll maybe find only 3 are your readers, like 3 are your people, the people who get your work and who can, who you can liaise with after the workshop, right? To exchange work, read work, give feedback. But I think, again, like Isi said, I read books I never would have read. So some of the books that were recommended to me that I read whilst thinking about House of Stone is this lovely book called That Mess on the Via Merulana. It's translated from Italian, right? And this was from a colleague, right? American, right? So it's also that idea of being American or where you're from does not necessarily Iowa. It was there at the library. I keep talking about this because it was fascinating. I didn't know that this was the case. Like, you go to a library and you find stacks of Zimbabwean literature in Ndebele as well, and Shona, right? And English, books that are out of print or not available in Zimbabwe, right? So I got that. So that was my biggest gift, the gift of writing. So how the Iowa workshop works, the most important thing you need to attend is workshop, right? It's very flexible that way. And the main thing that you're there for is to write. And so the way it's structured, the workshop tries to provide you with what you need to write. So if the materials I feel I need that are not there, you go and you request them. So that's the sort of greatest gift I had. And also community, right? So being around other writers, right? Who are passionate, who are ambitious, have a need to write, right? And of course, practical things, that Iowa agents come to Iowa, right? So there's also that sense of, these are opportunities I do not want to leave behind, right? And of course, so I think it becomes this environment of so many writers who are writing, who are thinking through work, right? What I didn't take, workshop culture can be hostile, okay? So I will tell the story, though this is live, sure. There was an instance where I had a very unsavory workshop letter from this older American male in workshop who turned very, I think, racist. Like, oh, you think you're from Africa, you think you can write. You walk around like you know how to write, you know. You need to know that you're a student, right? This was a student, it was not. So you understand, so there are those sort of shocking instances where you meet up with very hostile elements, and those are the sort of unsavory things you have to work through, right? You have to be prepared for some of those things, right? You're meeting people from very different backgrounds who may not be used to Africans, you know, Africans, the Africans that we are here as people, they have this stereotype. So those are some of the very unpleasant experiences I had. But my teachers, my professors were very supportive, very well learned, very caring, and that's what I appreciated for me about the workshop. I loved it so much.
Wow. The lady in blue.
Thank you, sir, Osondu and Novuyo. I have a question, like, I want a clarification. What's MFA program about? Then my question is to you, sir. You made mention that in your novel, I don't know if it's your normal style, but in this particular novel specifically, you said instead of chapters, you make use of characters. Now, I've seen a style like that in Isidore Bewo's Last Duty. My question is, I am confused as an upcoming writer. How do I manage to blend the stream of consciousness of characters where each of them is narrating the story through their own point of view? Like at the end, when you want to balance your conflict, how are you going to blend their stream of consciousness? Thank you.
You see, I think you should charge her for this.
Great question, yeah. Well, the first part was the MFA. The MFA actually is the Masters of Fine Arts. Yeah, that's what it means. And what it actually was originally was that people in the arts, like creative writing, like photography, like film, like dance, didn't have, there was no PhD program. The terminal degree was the MFA because it's seen like a workshop-based thing that artists go to this place and they are trained in the art itself. Okay, so that's, but you know, that's no longer the case anymore. Yeah. It's no longer a terminal degree for most people. But it's a huge, so you find courses like creative writing and photography still having MFA programs and some art as well. Yeah. The other question was about that style. I think that the idea of, I can see what you mean. You know, you have different voices. How do you ensure that, yes, that there is harmony? But, you know, I'll go to jazz music. Jazz gives us a perfect example of that. So how does jazz do it? There is, yes, you know, the jazz song is One Night in Tunisia. Okay, so we're playing One Night in Tunisia. Then the saxophonist goes on a frolic of his own. You know, it's called jazz, so it's improvisation, it's solo. Yeah. He goes on a solo thing, you know, does his thing, but he eventually comes back yeah. you know, to the theme and continues with One Night in Tunisia. The same thing will happen to the drummer. You know, he will go and then he will come back. Yeah. You know, listen to Fela Kuti, you know, I put my mouth for song, he will sing a song he's done before, then he comes back to the one, you know, one. So like in the case of this novel, it was so easy because they all lived in this house. And so because they all lived in this house at one point or the other, that became the One Night in Tunisia, you know, that they came back to. I should be charging you for this. I get paid to give this kind of advice. So, you know, yeah. So that's the thing. You know, I read Okwewo, but I don't remember that novel now. Yeah. But there has to be something that brings them back, you know. Right.
Yeah, so there's the question from the... And then we'll take you, Kodili, after.
Okay, thank you very much. Please, I'd like to know, because the major thematic preoccupation of African writers is about politics and nostalgia, of course. So what do you suggest about proliferation of utopia and science fiction in African contexts?
Yeah, that's a nice question, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, because I've always I've always been concerned, actually, about the fact that it does seem that the only thing African writers can do is write literary fiction, the kind of fiction that are studied in colleges and universities. And that's not right. You know, because of the thing, one of the things that has always bothered me is that there seems to be a way in which Africans are seen as being in the world, but not fully owning the world. Yeah, that if you're an African, then you perform being an African in this very limited way. And that there are those who are born in other parts of the world who own the world in a different way. And so they can decide that they're going to write sci-fi or they're going to be physicists, but at the same time they will play in a jazz band. They can be soccer players, but they make film at night. They can be but Africans were never allowed to be in the world in that way. And that's kind of hurt me because, you know, we all own the world together. Why would you want to own it much more than I do? And so I think, hey, go for it. Sci-fi, fantasy, it's always been there in our culture anyway. You know, it's not anything new, you know. And so I'm not surprised. In fact, I think what Mao said is really right. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. You know, I read sci-fi. I read it even before I knew what literary fiction was. And it's funny, but I think that we should be able to be in the world in so many different ways. Yeah. And literature is one of those possibilities, yeah.
So, another question from the back. Can we get a mic?
Did Novuyo want to add to that?
Oh, do you want to add to it?
No, I just thought my experience of being a writer, and I write literary fiction. But the first thing, I feel like Western spaces, and it's the box they let you onto. It feels no matter what you do, how you write, or who you are as an African, in the West, there are these boxes that they fit you into. Yeah. Just a small thing, when I was in Iowa, I had a white paid woman who tried to adopt me, and she wanted to buy me clothes, and this was her reason, because you're from Africa. So I remember that day I had to go and look at my wardrobe, like, do I walk around naked? What is going on? So it's just the same with fiction. So you find House of Stone, it's a literary fiction, but it does so many things, and there's a lot of literary styles, characterization, it's a mystery, it's a thriller, it's got all sorts of things. The first thing that Western reviewers latch onto is politics, and it's just very solemn voice. They're not right? So that's why I loved Helen Habila's review. I'm like, the Nigers are just doing me nice, He managed to capture, the range, right? And it's that thing of feeling ignored. Like, no matter what I do as an African, you now have to start fighting against these boxes, Like, you feel like you're not seen. They cannot see you beyond a box.
Novuyo, I think I have a question that I should still ask. And that's really about how do people in Zimbabwe approach this conversation of justice and closure, especially as regards the massacre?
The genocide is still an ongoing issue. We'll see what Mugabe 2.0, our new president, is going to be doing there. He opened a commission of inquiry, right? A commission of inquiry that's answerable to him. He was implicated in the genocide. He's denied responsibility. It's still a conscientious issue. We'll see how it goes as Zimbabwe moves on. But of course, it hasn't been fully addressed. In Mugabe's time, we couldn't talk about it. Mugabe 2.0 likes to have an aura of democracy. So we'll see how that aura can maybe slip in a few of these things, So, yeah.
So, a question from Okudili.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have one question for Isi Osondu, and I have one for the both of them. I remember reviewing This House Is Not For Sale, and I could see the similarities between your book and Ayana Mati's The 12 Tribes of Hati, where you usually in novels, when you have different characters, the characters repeat, something like that. But in your novel, once you have one character, you're done with that person, the person doesn't come back again. Was it conscious? Why I'm asking this question was because when I was reviewing it, I couldn't see any central theme. And so while in Ayana Mati's book, what connected everything was a matriarch, and yours was a patriarch, and there were central themes in that book, but in yours I couldn't find any central theme. I want to just ask here whether you had a central theme, So the second question I have for the both of you is, usually there's this, the books you people are discussing about are your second books. And there's this ideology that when you're writing your first book, you're writing it from a place of naivety, and you're allowed to make mistakes. And so what mistakes did you say, okay, this time I'm working on my second book and I will make this mistake that I made the first time, just for our own benefit? That's what I'm asking.
Those are great questions. Yeah. The first question is, these characters don't reoccur. I think one of them reoccurred later. But it's, like I said earlier, theory comes later. You theorize a book later. When you're in the moment, you're thinking of the story itself. And so based loosely on what I knew of the people who came to leave, they were transient. They come, they leave, and then they go. They basically disappear. They come, another set of people move in, they come, they leave, and they go. And so I wasn't thinking that, when I'm done with this book, and Okudili will ask a question about whatever happened to this character who you had in chapter 2. Why did he die? Did he come back? So to be honest, I'm being very honest, I never thought of that. It was just the way I thought that these characters lived. Okay, that they lived and then they left. But there is so many things tie them together. So many things tie them together. Many writers have. I didn't invent that idea at all. The other book you're talking about, I haven't read it. But, many authors have had, one of the things that you do in grad school is actually read what are called the themed collections. You're going to have only female characters. You could do what Faulkner did, which is have an imaginary country of your own where all the story unfolds. You could do what this guy did in his story collection called Winesburg, Ohio, which is have all the stories take place in the same locale, And so here, the whole story, everything unfolds in a house. There is this grandpa who's the patriarch who oversees the house, So it's the same locale. To be honest, I wasn't so much bothered by the book of short stories. You kind of sell yourself short, as it were. No pun intended, But if you say it's a novel, which is what the Americans do, they will always put the word novel on the cover. When you say it's a novel, it already has a certain gravitas, whether you intend it or not. And so I thought, well, okay, I've done the short story, no more short stories, but I'm going to smuggle the short story in and call it a novel, and people will say, it's a novel. And so that's basically what I did. Yeah, so I think the way we read novels is quite different from the way we read short stories. And that he said that somebody died of maybe carbon monoxide poisoning or something, but that the person's color was red. And then he later, after the book came out, he discovered that, no, that's not the color you turn when you die of such a thing. So,
so the issue of mistakes, Okudili. So Shadows, my collection, right, novella and short stories, I wrote that in South Africa. I was quite young. And I wrote those stories over a period of 5 years, right? I wasn't thinking of a collection, I was just writing, right? Then there was the novella, then my publisher was like, novella's thinking of Shadows. So I wrote House of Stone as if it was the only one. It's the only book at that time, it's the only book I'll ever write at that time. And I loved, again, I'll quote Helen in his review in The Guardian, right? He said, this is by no means a faultless book, but it's so big, right, and so impressive that it shrugs off its defects, right, and leaves the reader impressed. And that was my aim with House of Stone. I wanted to write a book, instead of it succeeding safely, I wanted it to fail spectacularly.
Quote.
And so I'm saying that because like my next book again, I don't want to compare the books because you're in a different space, When I wrote House of Stone, I had more resources, more access to time, more support, and I think that shows in the book. If I were to write Shadows now, it would be a different book, right? And so I try with all my books, even the book I'm writing, not to write a book like the one before. So this one will be totally different, even in the size, and as in scope and theme. So it's that idea, because the world is diverse, and as writers, right? if you think ourselves not as professionals only, right? Professionals, as amateurs. I like writers. Like the moment you try and professionalize too much and start thinking 3, 4, well, that doesn't work for me, right? So I like to maintain that sort of amateurish look, approach to the writing, because that's when I actually dig up things that seem to, I don't know, be useful to me as a writer, right? And I think to make the writing pop.
Yeah. A few more questions from the back, perhaps. Okay. One more question. I saw one hand up. Okay. Please, can we get a mic to him?
My question is, I'm not a writer, and I've been a professional writer, and I'm not also, I read, I love to read, that's all I can say about myself. And my question is related to how those of you who have carved our young, aspiring writers. Now, I realize both of you are diasporans, so that, of course, poses a challenge. So why I'm saying this is because I was fortunate to write a book, and I never thought it was anything. But I wrote a biography last year on late Brigadier Zakaria Maimalari. And it wasn't like I don't know what you call your own kind of writing, literary fiction, is it? Yeah. Like, mine wasn't so much fiction, it was actually anecdotal, based on interviews I conducted. Yeah. But here in Nigeria, the response was so amazing. I was shocked. You know, I had the acting president, I had former presidents, everybody was there for me. And just last month, the BBC invited me to London, where I gave a chat, you know, both Hausa and English service on the book, you know, and in SOAS, University of London, the Royal Military Academy in Sandhurst, they all asked for copies, which I gave them. Yeah. So for me, it was quite touching. My experience was quite touching because I'm an interloper, as it were. Yeah, you know, I'm an interloper in this field. Yeah. But I seem to have come in through the window.
Yes. You've taken over.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I really wonder. You started by saying I'm not a writer. No, so I wonder what you'll do. I've been on the BBC. I've been on Sandhurst. I've been there. I've been here. So if you were a writer, what would you do? Good question.
But my question is, so how do we
mentor last year? Even though it was not like the best possible time to go, but I did go. So Writivism has been involved in mentoring young African writers, the next generation of African writers. They have so many things that they've put in place. I give advice. You know, people send stories to me. I read them. I read those that I can read. You have to make time for yourself. You have to make time to be a good citizen of the literary community. You have to read and write your own work as well. Okay, so I read works by people, I give feedback, but that's not my day job, so I cannot do that all the time, you know. And of course, I don't count anymore. You know, the guy said you've come with your Nigerian hustle. I can't count the number of people I've done letters for to get into graduate programs. I can't keep count anymore. So, you know, one does what one can, but my culture doesn't allow me to advertise that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and so I was with Writivism when it started. Yeah. I'm the one who initiated the Writivism mentorship program. Yeah. I worked with Jalada, you know Jalada Africa, Pan-African. Yeah. I was there when it started, deputy editor, worked with him, up to about 2 years ago. So you do this work, but then I'm based at Chimamanda Adichie. So in 2007, I was in Zimbabwe. I saw on BBC Hard Talk Extra. I'll never forget this because so I saw her, I'm like, okay, this young woman, African woman, she's writing, and I wanted to be a writer. So I Googled her. I saw she's in America. I wrote her an email, very quick email, I'm a writer, I'm in Zimbabwe. I can't get your book here. I didn't have, couldn't afford the book, couldn't get it. Send me your book, I didn't think she responded, right? She sent me her book. Small thing, right? She sent me her book. That book, right, reading, that actually, I was 19, pushed me to really try and take my writing seriously. And so for me, it's also, there's the obvious things, right, which is, that's actually the best thing you can do for yourself as a writer. Read widely, read a lot. It's especially in Africa. I know in Zimbabwe, we don't have access to a lot of African fiction. Our libraries need that we need more intercontinental. But so for me to have this book, it's in people, Africans. It became something, and it's contemporary, right? It's not, Achebe and Ngugi, who we respect, but we read them at school, right? And that was something a gift that spurred me on as a writer. So that's another way that we can.
A big round of applause for the next hot panel at 2 p.m. Not a minute later. I look forward to seeing you then.